Rising Studios. Today I'm going to teach you how to use Satin Stitch. Satin Stitch is probably one of my favorite stitches. I use it all the time in all of my designs and I can't wait to share it with you. Satin Stitch is a fill stitch. It's basically like the coloring in of embroidery. You can get really nice, beautiful satin stitch with just a few simple techniques and lots of practice. I'm going to show you how to do it now. Begin satin stitch by bringing your needle up through one edge of the shape you want to fill, pulling your needle and thread all the way through till you bump into your knot, and then reinserting your needle on the other side of your shape directly across from where you brought it up. Pull the thread through, and that's your first stitch. Now, return to where you brought your needle up through the fabric for your first stitch, and bring it up again just very, very close to where you started your first stitch. Again, bring your needle back down on the side where you brought your first stitch to a close, just barely below that first stitch. These stitches should be very, very close together, not leaving any visible fabric in between the two. Each time you bring your needle up for a new stitch, make sure you bring it up on the same side. And each time you bring your needle back down through the fabric, bring it back down on the same side. This technique essentially wraps the section of fabric in thread, so the front and the back of your fabric are going to look pretty much the same. You want to keep all of your stitches going at the exact same angle throughout this shape. They should all be going perpendicular to the vertical sides of the rectangle, the tall sides. If you think of these two vertical sides as railroad tracks, your stitches would be the cross pieces, always trying to maintain the same angle and keeping them nice and straight across the tracks. It's best to use multiple strands of thread for satin stitch. I like using at least 3, and it's really important that you make sure for each stitch that all strands of thread have been pulled cleanly through to the back side of the fabric so that you don't have one strand sticking up a little bit. In order to make sure that each stitch sits nice and cleanly against that front side of the fabric, you can use your fingernail or the side of your needle to gently smooth them. If you end up making a stitch that's a little bit too far away from the stitch you did before, you can go ahead and go back and sneak in an extra little stitch in between the two. Just make sure you smooth it down with its neighbors to make sure that they look nice and natural, like they were placed that way on purpose. When you're working with satin stitch, try to keep the edges of your stitches right along the edges of your shape to give a nice clean line. As you bring your needle up and down through the fabric, you re-grip your needle many, many times. This can cause your thread to get twisted over time and cause your satin stitches to look a little bit ropey and not so smooth. Make sure that you stop and take breaks to smooth out twisted thread before you keep going. Once you finish filling your shape with satin stitch, you can go ahead and make sure all your stitches are nice and smooth. Use the side of your needle or your fingernail to smooth stitches in the direction that they're going. You can also use your needle to reach around the back side of the hoop and with that needle, gently tug on the back side of the stitches. So you're actually hooking the stitches onto your needle and gently tugging, and that way you pull any excess thread that's causing a stitch to stick up around to the back side. These extra steps at the end will give you that nice satiny look that gave this stitch its name. You can fill your shape with satin stitches in any direction. If it helps you to maintain a consistent angle with your stitches throughout a shape, one of my favorite tips is to grab your erasable fabric pen and actually draw in the lines on your fabric that indicate the direction you want your stitches to go. This gives you a bit of a guide as you stitch to make sure you're matching the angle that you want all the way across a shape. Often, when you want to fill a shape with satin stitch, it's not just a simple rectangle. Some shapes have sides with different lengths or are a curved area. I'm going to show you some of my favorite techniques for changing the angle of your stitches as you work throughout a space, or filling in a shape that has a long edge and a short edge. Remember that tip I told you earlier about the edges of a shape being like railroad tracks and your stitches being like those cross pieces? That'll be really important here. The inside edge and the outside edge of this rainbow are different lengths. So we're going to need to fit in more stitches along that outside edge than the inside edge. In order to keep our stitches perpendicular to the edges of the rainbow as we go, we'll also need to change the angle of our stitches as we go around. I'm going to use my erasable fabric pen again to mark where I want to begin. I'm going to begin with that straight stitch right at the top and then work my way around one side of the rainbow, and then do the same thing starting again at the center and working my way down the other side. I really love to begin satin stitches in the center of a shape. That helps me establish the angle that I want my stitches to be. So I'm going to begin right here in the center of this arched rainbow shape, and then slowly work my way down the first side. Always bring your needle up through the longer edge of your shape, bringing it back down through the edge that's shorter. That usually means bringing it up through the outside edge of a curve and ending your stitch on the inside edge of a curve. As you work your way around, you're quickly going to need to change angles. Bring a stitch up through the outside edge of the shape, but reinsert your needle down in the same hole that your previous stitch ended in. I call this technique hole sharing. You end the stitch here, and that makes that stitch go at a little bit of an angle. For your next stitch, do a completely regular stitch, giving each end of the stitch its own space. And then on the stitch after that, you'll whole share again. So begin your stitch in a new place on the edge of the shape and reinsert your needle down through the same place in the fabric where you ended your last stitch. When you have a pretty deep curve like this shape here, you'll want to do this whole sharing technique on every other stitch until you get to a place where you don't need to change angles anymore, like toward the bottom of this rainbow. As you can see, by using this whole sharing technique, my stitches are slowly starting to fan out and lean over to the angle I want them to be. Another technique I like to use in these sort of circumstances is stitch tucking. To tuck a stitch, bring your needle up through the outside edge of your shape, but instead of extending it all the way to the other side, only go about 2/3 of the way and complete your stitch slightly under the stitch you made last, like this. This helps you add more stitches on that outside edge of the shape where you have more space to fill without creating a whole bunch of extra bulky thread down at the inside of the rainbow. Always follow a tucked stitch with just a regular stitch that has its own space. Sometimes when whole sharing just isn't quite enough to change the angle and give you enough extra stitches on the outside edge of a shape, throwing in a few times of using this stitch tucking technique can be really helpful. Once you fill in down one entire side of your shape, return to the center and use the same techniques to fill in the other side, just as you did before. Let's take a look at this flower petal and see how we can use some of the same techniques to fill it in. The outside edge of the petal is much longer than this inside edge, so we're going to need to use a lot of whole sharing and stitch tucking to fill it in. I'm going to go ahead and draw in my angles for the petal that I want. I could fill the petal with stitches that are all straight, but I think it has a much nicer effect for flower petals if you fan your stitches out like this. With each new stitch, again, you'll want to make sure that you bring your needle up through the outside edge of the flower petal and back down through the inside by that flower center. You're going to have a lot more room up there at the top than you do at the bottom, and we're going to make sure that we don't add too many extra stitches down at the bottom so that it looks like a bunch of bulky thread. Again, make sure you do your first stitch in the middle to establish the angle that you want your petal to look like it's going at. So let's go ahead and place our first stitch here. I'm making sure it lines up at the center of the petal and the center of this area on the little flower center that we have that's connected to this petal. I'm going to work my way to the right side of the petal just like we did with the rainbow. Starting with a new stitch place here and then immediately doing some hole sharing. I have a long way to fan out, so I'm going to start now. Watch here as I alternate using both hole sharing techniques with a few stitch tucking techniques. I'm also going to make sure that when I do hole sharing, my stitches don't sit too much on top of one another. This can happen, but it's great if you can kind of hold your thread out of the way as you pull the thread to the back. That way they won't be too much overlapping. Use your finger or the side of your needle to smooth out your stitches as you go and make sure you're getting that nice smooth satin stitch effect. I hope you find these techniques helpful as you encounter satin stitch in your embroidery projects. There are so many ways to use satin stitch. Here are just a few examples. I've used satin stitch to fill in both the centers of the flowers and the petals in this hoop. You can see that my stitches gently fan out on each of the petals that are wider, and my stitches fill in this ring with the stitches going perpendicular to the edges of the ring for each one. Here I've used satin stitch to fill in the rows of this marbled hoop. Each row is a different color of satin stitches, and you can see again the stitches are going the short direction, filling in the space perpendicular to the edges. I've kept all of my stitches nice and close together to give a really clean, smooth texture. It's really important when you're adding rows of satin stitch on top of each other, like next to each other like these, that you, if you can, bring your needle up through the empty edge and back down through the edge that's already been stitched, like this. So I'm going to bring my needle up through this row and back down, sharing a hole with these stitches in the other color. This is really important because it reinforces the direction that this stitch is going, which is down into the fabric, instead of bringing my needle up through this side, which could pull these stitches slightly looser. That's not what we want. It'll give it a kind of bunched and bumpy look. As I fill in a row like this with satin stitch, I will of course remember to adjust the angle of my stitches as necessary and use those hole sharing techniques whenever I need to. Thanks for stitching with me.